6 months after the divorce, Daniel Cross believed he had already lost everything, until a single phone call shattered his entire world. His ex-wife, Claire Bennett, was in labor, alone, and she was carrying a secret large enough to dismantle his life. What she had concealed through all those months would change everything. Would he make it in time, and could love survive a truth sharp enough to kill it? That night, Savannah was swallowed by a violent storm, thunder ripping the sky open like the fury of an ancient god. In the abandoned industrial district on the southern side of the city, a faint light flickered from an old warehouse, sweeping across piles of rust-eaten steel drums stacked higher than a man's head. The air was thick with the cold bite of metal and the heavy stench of machine oil. At the center of it all, Daniel Cross stood tall as a stone pillar in the middle of the tempest, his eyes cold, his shoulders bearing the weight of a man who had spent too long living between blood and darkness. He did not need to say a word, for his presence alone was enough to make the men around him hold their breath. The men under his command, former soldiers and loyal associates from his New Jersey days, were checking shipments of handguns, ammunition, and military equipment that ordinary people should never see. They knew better than to interrupt him when he was watching. Daniel examined a semi-automatic pistol, dismantling and reassembling it with the ease of a man handling a child's toy. The halogen lights overhead cast sharp beams across his face, illuminating the thin scar that stretched from his left cheekbone down to his jawline, a relic from the years when he still belonged to the northern underworld. Since tearing the organization apart with his own hands, Daniel had moved to Savannah and lived quietly under the guise of a private security worker, but old ties never truly died. He still had to clean up the remnants, eliminate threats, protect the innocent from men who once called him boss. Tonight was one of those nights. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan, until the phone in his jacket vibrated. Daniel frowned. An unknown number. In his world, a nameless call was rarely a good sign, yet something deep inside him twisted, a sharp and restless feeling like a needle piercing straight through his chest. He answered. A trembling female voice rushed through the line. "Is this Mr. Cross? I'm the charge nurse on duty at St. Mary's Hospital. We have a patient, Claire Bennett, admitted in critical condition. She is in labor, but complications are severe." The nurse's voice faltered, breathless with urgency. She arrived with absolutely no identification, no wallet, nothing. But she was clutching a cheap, disposable burner phone in her hand, so tight we had to pry it loose. There were no contacts saved, no call history. But Mr. Cross, we found one single unsent message in the drafts folder. It was typed, out just minutes before she lost consciousness, but she never pressed send. It reads, "Daniel, I'm sorry. Save our son." And your number was in the recipient box. I don't know who you are, but you are the only link she has left to this world. In an instant, Daniel's world collapsed. The crates of weapons, the thunder, the metallic smell, the men bent over their inspections all blurred into a dull, distant backdrop. Save our son. The words burned into his retina as if he were reading them himself. She hadn't just left. She hadn't simply stopped loving him. She had been hiding. And in her final moment of consciousness, she wanted to call him for help but stopped herself, terrified that even a signal might put him in danger. The hand holding the phone turned white from the force of his grip, and his free hand slammed down on the metal table, making the tools rattle. He turned away and walked toward the door without saying a single word. His men lifted their heads and silently stepped aside to form a path. None of them had ever seen Daniel like this, not furious, not cold, but shaken. A kind of panic they never believed could exist in the man who had survived dozens of raids and assassinations. Rain lashed against him as the warehouse door swung open. Water soaked his shoulders, hair, and shirt, but Daniel did not care. His mind pulsed with a single rhythm, a drumbeat of words crashing over each other. Claire. In labor. Alone. Complications. The ache in his chest ignited, not from any physical wound but from an emotion he had locked away for far too long, now breaking free with violent force. Memories of her rose one after another in slow motion. Her midnight smile in their small kitchen, her embrace after a long day, her gentle fingers straightening his collar before he left the house. And the last day, her face stripped of tears, her voice dry and merciless, as she said she could not stay. He had believed her, tortured himself with the thought, but now she was on a delivery table, alone, carrying a secret he never knew existed. He climbed into his car, slammed the door, and gripped the steering wheel. Through the sheet of rain that blurred his windshield, his eyes no longer held fear but a primal instinct, the kind a man feels when he realizes he might lose the one thing he never knew he still had: a family. If you are listening now and feel this story stirring something inside you, take a second to subscribe, like, and share this video to support us in bringing heartfelt stories like this every day. And if you don't mind, would you tell me where you are watching from? Leave a comment below, and let us know which corner of the world this story has reached. We cherish every word you share. The downpour hammered the windshield like a curtain, sealing off every possible escape, the sound beating against the glass like drums pounding inside Daniel's chest. He started the engine, which roared with the same fury and unease, surging through him. His hands trembled on the wheel, not from cold but from the echo of the nurse's words tolling in his head like a funeral bell. Claire was giving birth, alone, complications. For 6 months he had taught himself to go silent before the grief of losing her. Each morning in the empty house he forced himself to believe he had let it go, that she had left for a reason he did not deserve to know. But the truth now surged toward him like a tidal wave. She had not simply disappeared. She had been carrying a part of him, the baby. No, impossible. Daniel clenched his jaw, his knuckles white around the steering wheel. Thoughts shattered through his mind. Images of Claire etched sharply into memory. The way she smoothed his hair when he fell asleep in his chair after a long night. The soft light in her eyes whenever she poured his coffee. Her laughter when he burned the toast. Every small detail now rearranged itself into cruel pieces of a secret he had never been allowed to see. If she was giving birth now, she must have been pregnant when she left him. 6 months. He did not need to count. And worse, she intended to face this alone, to keep the child as something no longer connected to him. Why? The question cut into his thoughts like a blade, tearing through every defense he had built. Not because he did not deserve to know, but because she feared he would know. He had faced arms traffickers, drug lords, traitors. None of them made him feel as powerless as he felt now, hurtling through George's storm-soaked night toward St. Mary's Hospital, where the woman he had once loved down to his bones was fighting life and death alone. The traffic light ahead blurred into a red smear through the rain-washed windshield, glowing like blood over his vision. He did not stop. He could not. Every second meant another second of Claire's isolation, another breath of pain with no one beside her. He pushed the accelerator, the tires screaming across the Thesis, flooded street. Could it be she had not left out of coldness but to protect something, or someone? He remembered their last days together. She had grown quiet, glancing over her shoulder whenever they walked outside, flinching when strangers approached. He had assumed it was stress from the world he was trying to leave behind, the danger that still clung to him after he dismantled the organization. But now each behavior carried a different meaning. Claire had known something he did not, perhaps a threat, a warning, an enemy's shadow, and she had chosen what she believed was the only way to keep him safe, to walk away. Daniel swore under his breath, not at her but at the men who had driven her to believe disappearance was her only option. He did not know what awaited him at the hospital, or whether the child was truly his. But one thing was certain. If Claire had endured all of this alone for 6 long months, then from this moment forward, she would never face anything alone again. The car sped through the flooded streets of Savannah, slicing through the rain like the layers of memory Daniel no longer had the strength to hold on to. And every gust of wind slamming against the vehicle felt like a blade cutting across his chest, sending his thoughts tumbling into chaos. Every sense in his body was drawn taut, like a string. Not from fear, but from a tidal surge of emotion he had not yet found a name for, a surge made of panic and anger and aching sorrow, and the most dangerous thing a man who has crawled out of darkness could ever feel: hope. Inside him was not only the turmoil of a man who had been denied the truth about his own child for almost a year, but the piercing realization that the only woman he had ever loved might have gambled her life to protect him. The road to St. Mary's Hospital was less than 10 miles long, but to Daniel it stretched out like the descent into the deepest corner of hell. He could not stop himself from seeing Claire alone in the delivery room, sweat beading on her forehead, fingers clutching the sheets in pain, her eyes searching for someone who was not there. She had once been the center of his world, the very breath that kept him alive in the years when survival was measured in bullets. And now, in the moment she needed him most, she had pushed him out of everything. He did not know which hurt more, that she had been so afraid she chose to leave him without a word, or that he had let it happen without fighting harder for them. The rain hammered the windshield as if the sky itself were raging over the words the two of them had never said, and the rhythmic sweep of the wipers, the roar of the engine as he pushed through a red light, and the thunder of his heartbeat filled the car like the drum of impending fate. He had never known fear like this, not fear of enemies, not fear of death, but fear of being too late, fear of losing her, fear of never seeing the child she was trying to bring into the world alone. Years spent living on the razor's edge had forged Daniel into a man of steel. Yet in this moment he finally understood what it meant to be fragile, fragile in the way only love could make a man. What Claire had endured alone began to weigh unbearably on his mind. The months of carrying a child with no one to confide in, the silent terror in every step she took, every checkup she walked into without a hand to hold, every night she jolted awake from pain or fear, every flutter of tiny feet inside her belly that she felt alone. Daniel clenched his jaw, eyes burning yet unwavering. He would not let her be alone anymore. Whatever waited at the end of this road, whether it was a brutal truth or her anger or the cold refusal in her eyes, he would not turn back. The faint glow of the hospital lights emerged through the rain, blurring and trembling in the storm. Daniel tightened his grip on the wheel, his heart pounding wildly at the thought of the moment the delivery room doors would swing open. He was not ready. But real love had never required readiness, only the courage to step forward even when everything might shatter. The rain kept falling as Daniel slammed the brakes at the entrance of St. Mary's Hospital, the tires screeching across the slick pavement like a swallowed scream. He sat motionless for several seconds, his hands still locked around the steering wheel, his heart thrashing against his ribs as everything he had suppressed broke loose. He leaned back, eyes closed, and memories rose again like ghosts, threading themselves through his bones. 6 months earlier, the sky had been rainy too, not as violent as tonight but steady and bleak. Claire had stood in their small kitchen, the soft yellow light casting a muted glow across her expressionless face, and the divorce papers lay on the table like a foreign object in a space once filled with laughter. Daniel remembered every detail, the smell of burnt bread lingering from a forgotten toaster, the ticking of the clock on the wall like a cold soundtrack to the collapse that was coming. He had walked into the house relieved after a tense meeting, eager to see Claire in her oversized sweater with her gentle eyes, but instead found her standing still, her hand resting on the table, her head bowed slightly, not meeting his gaze. He had known something was wrong, but he had not imagined the worst until she pushed the document toward him. "I signed it," she had said, her voice steady as though she were announcing the weather. Daniel thought he had heard wrong. "Signed what?" he asked, though dread had already begun to coil inside him. Claire lifted her head, and he would never forget the look in her eyes, hollow and stripped of light. Not angry, not grieving, but carrying a chilling surrender. The divorce papers. The words fell like a blade. Daniel froze, staring at the face of the woman he loved more than his own life, unable to understand what was happening. "Why?" he whispered, barely able to force out the sound. Claire avoided his eyes. "Because I do not love you anymore." 4 small words, each one a bullet tearing through him. He had let out a bitter laugh, thinking it was some cruel joke, but Claire did not smile. She said nothing else, only stood there with her gaze fixed on the floor as if looking at him would break her in half. He had stepped closer, trying to take her hand, but she stepped back. "You are lying," he had whispered. "What is going on? Are you in trouble? Is someone threatening you?" She had shaken her head, relentless in her coldness. "No one is threatening me. I am just tired. I cannot keep living with a man like you, with your past, with your ghosts. I want an ordinary life." Those sentences echoed now in his mind, each word branded into him with fire. But now that he knew she was in labor, alone, now that time and truth had begun peeling away their masks, he understood. Claire had lied, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. That emptiness in her eyes had not been a lack of love, but the pain of having to bury it. She had left to protect him, there could be no doubt. Because otherwise, there was no reason a woman like Claire, who once held him every night and called him her home, would choose to vanish into silence. Daniel opened his eyes, his jaw tight and blood surging hot through his veins. He did not know what she had endured during those 6 months, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would not let her walk alone ever again. Whether she still loved him or not, whether she gave him another chance or left him standing at the door, whether their past was cruel or not, in this moment she and the child needed him. And this time, he would not arrive too late. Claire clutched the bedsheet, her fingers pale and bloodless from tension and pain, and a violent contraction surged through her abdomen, forcing her to grit her teeth as her entire body went rigid, her breath sharp and uneven, as though the air itself were draining out of the room. Cold sweat drenched her forehead and trickled down onto the pillow, while the monitor beside her beeped steadily, the baby's heartbeat still strong, but her own was not, her heart stumbling into an erratic, frantic rhythm like a soundtrack for the fear that had haunted her every day for the past 6 months. The bright white hospital lights offered no sense of safety, for no room, no matter how sterile or quiet, could drown out the feeling of being watched, a feeling that had clung to her since the day she left Daniel. She had sensed it in the stranger who lingered too long at the cafe, in the heavy footsteps behind her after a late shift, in the nameless envelope dropped into her mailbox with a trembling warning scrawled across the page. She had dreamt of Daniel being shot in the middle of the street, blood spreading across the pavement, his eyes searching for her one last time before fading, and that nightmare repeated again and again until she woke with her hand over her stomach, whispering dull comforts to the tiny life that had yet to take its first breath. And now, when everything had finally grown quiet, her baby chose this moment to come into the world, leaving her alone in a cold, lonely room with no family beside her, no Daniel, no arms to lean into. She turned to the nurse, adjusting the equipment, the woman's eyes warm but shadowed with worry. The nurse asked softly if she was absolutely sure she did not want someone called, and Claire swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry, whispering for her not to call anyone, each word dragged from the deepest, most frightened part of her. The nurse hesitated briefly, wanting to say more, but eventually offered only a small nod. Claire looked back at the ceiling, unable to let Daniel appear here, not while the possibility remained that someone was still tracking her, not when one small mistake could undo every sacrifice she had made. She had left not because love had died, but because she loved him too deeply. If she had not seen the message on the phone of one of Daniel's former associates that night, she would never have known about the plan to kill him in its cruelest form by targeting the person he loved. They had not intended to shoot Daniel. They had intended to kill her, and Daniel would be left breathing with a wound that would never heal. She could not allow that. Even if it meant using the cruelest words, cutting every bond, accepting the weight of his hatred, she had to do it. But no one had warned her that her heart would refuse to obey, that she would cry for him every night, that every flutter of the baby's movements would make her imagine Daniel's hand over her stomach, his eyes full of wonder, that every prenatal appointment would play in her mind like the image of him sitting outside the room, so nervous he forgot to breathe. Claire bit down on her lip to stifle a sob just as another contraction seized her, stronger than before, bending her forward, her whole body trembling. The nurse rushed to her side, gripping her hand, urging her to hold on, promising things would be all right, but Claire shook her head, eyes squeezed shut, tears sliding down her temples as she whispered that it would not be all right, that he must not know, that he must not come here, begging the words out between waves of pain. In her panic, she could only pray that Daniel was somewhere far away, safe, unaware of the storm tearing through her heart, because if he knew, if he came, everything could end forever. As the pain subsided slightly, Claire let her body sink back into the bed, staring blankly at the white ceiling as the sounds around her faded, leaving only the pounding of her heart and fragments of memories rising like trembling shadows, dragging her back to a March evening when everything first began to fall apart. The sky had been colorless that day, Savannah holding its breath, and Claire had returned home after a grueling shift, exhausted and longing for sleep, but froze when she saw the nameless envelope in the mailbox. Inside was a single sheet of paper, thin and creased, the handwriting jagged, unsigned, unidentifiable, yet its message cut through her like a blade. If she stepped back into Daniel's house even once more, she would never step out again. And if he survived the next 6 months, it would be because she left immediately. No warning, no chance, only one choice. Claire had stood frozen on the porch, her hands trembling as she folded the letter back into its envelope, the breeze lifting strands of her hair across her face in a cold, uncanny whisper. She looked toward the spot where Daniel always parked his car, where he used to open the door for her each morning, where he used to kiss her forehead before leaving for work, and every one of those memories twisted into blades inside her chest. She knew she could not ask him about the threat, knew he would fight, would confront, would never allow her to leave because of some unseen danger, and it was precisely that defiance that had nearly gotten him killed before. This time they were not aiming at him. They were aiming at her, and not just her, but the child she had not yet told him about. Claire had stood for hours in the bathroom afterward, hot water pouring over her shoulders but doing nothing to wash away the dread crawling beneath her skin. She did not sleep that night, sitting in the dim living room with the letter in front of her, her hand resting on her stomach, quietly counting the tiny heartbeats forming within her. That was when she made her decision. No goodbye, no tears, no explanations. She scribbled a few words, signed the divorce papers that had sat in the drawer for months, and placed them on the table like a sentence passed. When Daniel came home, she met him in the kitchen, burying every expression, crushing every flicker of love rising behind her eyes. She forced herself to lie, forced herself to kill his trust in order to save the lives of all three of them. In the days that followed, Claire lived like a shadow. She moved to a small town to the south, changed her name on every document, cut all contact, and during every prenatal appointment she hid her information, avoiding every security camera she could. She did not dare call, did not dare write, terrified that even a whisper of longing might pull her back. Every bout of nausea, every weary walk home, every night under a star-filled sky with no one beside her, she had to remind herself that everything she did was for love. Now, lying here as the pain stretched through her in relentless waves, she could not help wondering if she had been right. For she had saved Daniel from death but condemned herself to a year of isolation and stripped him of the right to be a father. And if he walked through that door now, if he stepped into this room, she did not know if she had the strength to push him away again, because her heart had stopped obeying her a very long time ago. The automatic glass doors of St. Mary's Hospital slid open as Daniel rushed inside, with his rain-soaked coat clinging to his shoulders, and his desperate eyes searching the cold, bright hallway, his breath ragged, his chest rising and falling sharply, his hands still trembling after a drive that felt like a race against death itself. The stabbing aches in his chest did not come from exhaustion but from the overwhelming tide of emotion sweeping through him and tearing down whatever composure he had left. He had lived through gunfire shrieking past his ears, through nights stained with the last breaths of fallen brothers, but never had he felt as powerless as he did now, with the woman he still loved lying beyond those walls, fighting through pain and fear, while he remained helpless on the outside. The nurse's station blurred before his rain-dampened eyes as he approached, his voice hoarse when he asked for Claire Bennett, explaining that she was in labor, stumbling over the words as he tried to call himself her husband, her family, her anything. The young nurse behind the desk hesitated and told him gently that Claire had requested no visitors and that the delivery was happening in a restricted area, and without proper identification, she could not let him through. But Daniel cut her off with a gaze so cold and hollow, it made her falter. He insisted he did not need to enter the delivery room. He only needed to know whether she was all right, begging her softly under the harsh white lights that revealed the exhaustion and desperation carved into his face. After a moment, the nurse's voice softened, telling him Claire was stable but in great pain, that the baby was turning in the wrong position, and the doctors were monitoring her closely. Daniel went still, the strength draining from his limbs, and he turned away, pressing a hand against the counter to swallow, the bitter knot rising in his throat. Part of him wanted to break down every door in the hospital and run to her side, to take her hand and whisper that she was no longer alone, but another part knew he had forfeited that right the moment she walked away. He had lived 6 months wrapped in an empty silence, haunted by questions that never had answers, but now those answers were slowly revealing themselves in harsh, painful pieces. Claire had not left because she stopped loving him. She had left to protect him, and now she was bearing the cost of that decision in agony and tears no one else could see. Daniel stepped back and found his way to the long row of chairs along the wall, where the fluorescent lights cast shadows over silent figures. He sat heavily, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, burying his face in his hands, trying to calm the violent rhythm of his breathing, while his mind split in two under the weight of love and regret. He should have been with her. He should have known. He should have felt something was wrong from the beginning. Instead, he had left her to face her terror alone, carrying the fear that should have been shared by both of them. Each minute crawled past like an eternity, and he watched the minute hand on the clock creep forward through the cold ticking of time, then turned toward the end of the hallway where a closed door stood like an impenetrable barrier against hope. He did not pray, because he had long stopped believing in such things, but this time, he closed his eyes and clung to one desperate wish. Let her live. Let the baby live. And if fate allowed it, let him have one final chance to make things right. Inside the delivery room, Claire braced herself as another contraction tore through her, ripping along her muscles like a wave determined to break her apart, her vision blurring with tears as her hands dug into the bed sheets, her nails leaving deep impressions in the fabric. She no longer sensed time or space or the voices around her, only the frantic beeping of the heart monitor and the shallow, weakening rhythm of her own breaths as if she were drowning in open water. A familiar voice echoed faintly in her mind, his voice murmuring on a stormy night long ago, promising he would always be there. But he was not here now, and no one else was. And she was the one who had chosen this emptiness. She felt so cold, not the sterile chill of the hospital air, but a coldness radiating from deep within her chest, born from fear and loneliness, and the haunting question of whether her choice had saved anyone, or only shattered everything beyond repair. A nurse pressed a cool hand to her forehead, wiping sweat and encouraging her to push, but the words barely reached her as her thoughts filled with Daniel's face, his longing eyes, his warm hand wrapped around hers during sleepless nights, the way he used to look at her as if she were the only thing in the world that made life bearable. She remembered how she had extinguished that look with her own hands, and a sob escaped her as she turned her head to hide the tears burning down her temples. She could not cry, not now, not when the baby had not yet arrived, not while she was still fighting through waves of pain and terror that consumed every corner of her strength. She felt weaker than she had ever been. No longer the woman who once stood tall against the world, no longer the woman strong enough to sign divorce papers without looking back. She was simply a mother, frightened to her core, terrified her child would not be safe, terrified she would not survive this, and more than anything terrified that if Daniel learned the truth he would hate her forever. But buried beneath all those fears was another she could not deny. A tremor in her heart she tried to silence but could not. She wanted him here, right now, right beside her. She wanted his hand in hers, his voice telling her everything would be all right, his shoulder for her tears, letting her stop pretending to be strong. A part of her prayed he would stay far away so everything could end quietly as she had planned, but another part, the part trembling and breaking inside her, prayed that when the door opened, the first face she would see would be his, because if he made it here, if he forgave her, if he still loved her even a little, then perhaps she would find the strength to endure this. A nurse whispered to her gently that it was time, that the moment was almost here, and Claire nodded even though she had no idea how much strength she had left, closing her eyes and drawing one deep breath as she imagined Daniel's hand closing around hers, and his gaze filled not with blame but with love and forgiveness. That fragile image the only thread pulling her back from the edge of fear as she clung to whatever hope she had left, even if it was only for one final second. Hurried footsteps echoed through the hallway as the team of doctors and nurses prepared for the final moments of labor, and the bright white lights shone directly onto Claire's pale face as she bit down hard on her lip, sweat pouring from her skin as though she had just survived a storm. The relentless waves of pain made her entire body tremble, but she refused to collapse, for she had reached the very edge between life and fear, and there was no turning back now. The child inside her was fighting to enter the world, and no matter how many ghosts waited outside those walls, she had to bring this fragile new life toward the light. A nurse leaned close to her ear, whispering that she needed one more push, that they could already see the head, urging her to hold on. And Claire clenched her teeth and forced her strength upward through a pain that felt like her entire body was being torn apart. And then, in the split second when she believed she could not go on, a hand suddenly closed around hers, warm and trembling and achingly familiar. She turned her head, and her eyes met his. Daniel. He stood there, rain still clinging to his hair and jacket, worry carved deep into the lines of his face, his eyes dark and bottomless, as if the whole world had collapsed into that single gaze. He did not speak. He simply nodded once, gently, but in that look she saw everything she had tried to bury: pain, love, anger, regret, and forgiveness. A sob burst from her as another contraction tore through her, but Daniel's hand held hers firmly, steady, unyielding. This time, she was not alone. With one final breath, Claire gathered every last remaining shred of strength and pushed. The world seemed to shatter into silence for a heartbeat, and then a cry rose through the room, high and piercing, cutting through the storm that raged outside the city. The cry of a newborn life. For a moment everyone froze, then motion returned to the room as the doctor lifted the baby, cut the cord, wrapped him in a blanket, and placed him in Claire's arms. She looked at the tiny boy, her lips trembling as tears streamed uncontrollably down her cheeks. A son, small and flushed and fragile, but alive and strong. Her son, Daniel's son. She looked toward him, and though he said nothing, his eyes blazed with something too deep to name. He leaned down, touching one gentle fingertip to the tiny fist, curled tightly, as though grasping the destiny of them all. Claire breathed the word softly, barely more than a breath. Noah. Daniel lifted his gaze, his eyes still wet. She managed a weary but sincere smile. His name is Noah. He nodded. No other words were needed, because in that single moment every question had already been answered. No explanations, no blame, only a child, a hand clasped tight, a gaze that refused to turn away, and a love reborn from pain that once seemed impossible to survive. Daniel stood silently beside the bed, unable to look away from the tiny baby resting peacefully in Claire's arms, the rest of the world fading into a blur until only that little form remained, miraculous and impossibly delicate. He had never imagined he would live to see such a moment, let alone one powerful enough to split his heart open. Somehow this small child was the living proof of a love that had once seemed beyond repair, the embodiment of everything they had been, everything they had lost, and everything they were now struggling to protect. Claire looked at him with exhaustion, softening her voice but tenderness still glowing in her eyes, asking quietly if he wanted to hold the baby. Her question broke the silence inside him and pulled him back from his dazed disbelief. He did not speak, only nodded, and Claire lifted the newborn carefully, placing him into Daniel's arms. The instant that tiny body touched his chest, something in Daniel changed forever. The feeling was unlike anything he had ever known, unlike the first time he held a gun, unlike the moment he stepped out of the underworld, unlike the night he watched Claire walk away without a word. This feeling was so pure it nearly stole his breath. Noah was so light, so impossibly small, as though a single wrong breath might startle him, yet every slight movement the baby made pulled the entirety of Daniel's world into a single fragile point. His chest tightened, and a sound escaped him, something between a laugh and a sob he could not contain. He had never pictured himself as a father, had spent a life in places where love was a luxury and attachment was something that died the moment the sun rose. Then Claire came, a crack in the ice he wore like armor, but even then he had never dared dream of a family. And yet here he was, holding his son, the walls inside him falling apart one by one. Each second made him realize how much he had missed, how many moments he had not been there for, the first flutter in her womb, the beat of a tiny heart on an ultrasound. The small smile Claire surely had the first time she felt him kick. He had missed all of it. But now, with his child in his arms, he vowed he would never lose another second. He bent his head and pressed a trembling kiss to the baby's forehead, whispering an apology in a voice that broke. "I am so sorry, Noah. Your father came too late." Claire watched them, tears streaming freely, and her eyes held no fear now. No distance, only love and release. Daniel looked up at her, and for the first time in so many months, they understood each other without speaking. He settled beside her, still holding Noah, feeling the baby's faint breaths warming his chest, and in that moment time itself seemed to pause. The storm outside might still rage, the world might still be full of danger, but here in this room he held his entire universe in his arms, and he knew he would protect it with everything he had left. Claire leaned back against the pillow, the soft lights casting a warm glow over her exhausted, pale face. Beside her, Daniel remained fixed on Noah's every tiny movement, as if looking away even beside, for an instant might cause the moment to slip away. Neither of them spoke for a long time, not because words were absent but because the moment was too fragile for anything less than truth. Finally Claire reached out, touching his arm lightly, her voice nearly a whisper but steady as she asked whether he wanted to know everything. Daniel lifted his head, his eyes calm and deep as night, nodding once. Claire swallowed, glancing at their son, and then at him. She confessed that the day she left had never been about wanting to end things, that she had learned she was pregnant exactly 1 week before receiving the letter. Daniel's brow furrowed, and she continued, her voice shaking but her gaze unbroken, describing the anonymous warning that told her Daniel would only survive 6 months if she walked away, that the threats she saw following her were real, that she could not risk staying by his side, not with him and not with the unborn child. Daniel's hand tightened slightly, a small tremor crossing his jaw as he listened, silent but intensely present. Claire went on, the tears falling freely now as she admitted she knew he would never allow her to go, that he would fight, would face anything, but she could not bear the thought of him dying because of her. She had chosen the most painful path, chosen to lie, to sign the papers, to tell him she no longer loved him, hoping that he would hate her enough to survive. Daniel leaned back, staring at the ceiling as his throat tightened, and after a long moment he asked whether she truly believed he wanted a life without her. Claire closed her eyes, breaking under the weight of her own heartbreak, admitting that she had hoped his hatred would keep him alive, that she had chosen his safety over everything else. Daniel looked at her for a long time, then down at Noah, who slept quietly against his chest, and finally whispered that he had not hated her, that he had been dying a little each day without her, that without her he no longer knew who he was. Claire touched the baby with a trembling hand, apologizing for the chaos she had caused but confessing she would make the same choice again because she could not sacrifice the 2 people she loved most. Daniel did not answer immediately. He gently placed Noah in the small crib beside Claire, then turned back and took her hand firmly. He told her she no longer had the right to choose alone, that whatever came next he would stay, regardless of who pursued him or how many ghosts his past held, that all that mattered was her presence and the safety of their son. Claire broke down, pressing her face into his hand as sobs shook her, and in that moment every pain, every sacrifice, every lie crumbled away, leaving only one undeniable truth. They still loved each other, and that love, scarred and battered as it was, had somehow found its way home. The room settled into silence after the tears and the confessions, and Daniel kept holding Claire's hand, his gaze softening after the storm of emotions that had passed through him. Beside them, Noah slept peacefully, his tiny face flushed with a calm warmth, his breaths rising and falling in an innocent rhythm, as if the world outside had never known darkness. It was a moment of peace they never imagined they would ever be granted again after everything they had survived. Claire closed her eyes, and for the first time in many long months, she felt she could finally breathe. Daniel, meanwhile, only wanted to hold the moment still a little longer, just a little longer, as though happiness newly returned might vanish if he blinked. Then his phone vibrated in his pocket. A single, soft buzz. Ordinary. But for a man who had lived too long in the shadows, Daniel knew ordinary never truly existed. He pulled out the phone slowly, the glow of the screen highlighting the faint scar along his thumb. One message. No name. No saved number. Only a short sentence staring back at him. They know about your son. Daniel froze. His heartbeat seemed to stop for a single beat, then thundered violently like a warning drum. He stared at the screen without blinking. 5 words, and yet the weight of them struck him like a blow to the chest. They knew. They had found a trail. Claire, Noah, both lying right here. No guards, no protection, nothing between them and a merciless hand if it reached this door. Claire's eyes snapped open when she felt his grip tighten, and she immediately registered the tension in his face. "What is it, Daniel?" she whispered as she pushed herself upright, instinctively alert. He did not answer right away. Instead, he handed her the phone silently. Claire read the message, and her face drained of color, the fragile hope in her eyes extinguishing like a candle in the wind. "No, it can't be," she breathed, her voice breaking. Daniel stood, and in an instant, the tenderness of the new father vanished, replaced by the cold, sharp presence of a man who had survived too many wars in the dark. "We're out of time. I need you to trust me one more time, Claire. Take what you need. Don't tell anyone. I'll take care of the rest." She stared at him, fear rising in her chest, but she recognized that look, the look of a man who had walked into hell before to protect what mattered, and hell had returned. This time, they would not run. But before anything else, Noah had to be protected. Daniel stepped toward his son and looked at the baby one more time. His eyes darkened, though his voice was calm in a way that was far more terrifying. If they touch him, if they lay a finger on him, I will turn this entire world to ash. Daniel left the room only seconds after reading the message, his steps quick and precise but without drawing attention, his movements controlled with the discipline of someone who had lived too long among shadows where the smallest mistake cost blood. In his mind, details formed a map instantly: the hospital layout, the entrances, the number of exits, the camera placement, staff rotations, weather conditions. He moved to the front desk, using the authority of a family member to request a room transfer for Claire due to privacy concerns, along with enough cash to prevent further questions. Within minutes, Claire was moved to an isolation room on the 3rd floor, the quietest and least trafficked part of the building. Daniel instructed that all information regarding patient Claire Bennett be placed under temporary confidentiality. No room listing, no visitor permissions, no call transfers. Then he pulled out his phone again, accessing an encrypted satellite interface he had once used for special operations. He might have stepped away from the underworld, but the tools and the instincts had never left him. A map of cellular activity around the hospital appeared. 3 suspicious devices repeatedly connected and disconnected near the parking lot over the past 30 minutes. He marked the coordinates and sent out a localized signal jammer that blocked communication within a 200-meter radius around Claire's ward. If the enemy was waiting outside, they would receive no further instructions. Back in the room, Daniel locked the door, drew the curtains, and scanned the space. Claire looked at him, tense but not panicked, holding Noah close to her chest, the baby's breath soft and steady like a feather rising and falling. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder, steady and grounding. "There's someone inside, someone on staff. It could be security, a technician, a supply runner. They're waiting for confirmation." Claire bit her lip, her fingers tightening around the blanket. "Do they know what I look like?" Daniel shook his head. "Not yet, but they know there's a child. The message didn't mention you. It said your son. Their target is Noah. Maybe to pressure me, maybe to force me out," Claire whispered, her voice fracturing. "They'll kill Tim." Daniel sat down beside her, putting his hand over hers. "No, I'm getting you both out before they make a move. I called a private medical transport. The driver is one of mine. 10 minutes. He'll arrive at the back entrance disguised as a transfer team." Claire looked at him as though she wanted to argue, to demand he stay with them, but the look in his eyes silenced her. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to lose except the 2 lives in front of him. Daniel walked to the window, lifting the curtain just enough to see the parking lot. A black SUV had pulled in at the far corner, engine still running. He memorized the license plate and sent it to the system. A code returned almost instantly: fake plates. Threat confirmed. He turned back, his voice losing all softness. "Change Noah's clothes. Pack only essentials. Nothing unnecessary. I'll carry him. When I say we move, we don't stop." Claire nodded without hesitation. She had seen Daniel handle far worse than this. But this time, what he was protecting was not information or territory, it was their child. Within minutes, they were ready. Daniel held Noah tightly, wrapped in a thin blanket. Claire walked beside him, her hands steady even though her eyes never left her son. They paused at the door for a single breath, the hallway beyond stretching long and uncertain. Daniel looked at Claire, then at Noah. "Let's go." The door swung open, and the corridor seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of them. But Daniel had already mapped every step. This time, not a single mistake would be allowed. The rubber soles of the nurses' shoes echoed somewhere down the quiet hospital corridor, each step stretching the tension hanging thick in the air. Daniel walked ahead. Noah nestled safely in his arms, the newborn's tiny eyes still closed, unaware that every step his parents took was a battle between life and death. Claire followed close behind, her gaze flicking constantly to both sides of the hallway. Even the slightest shadow shifting behind a curtain made her heart clench. Cold sweat gathered on her brow despite the sterile chill of the hospital. She had never felt this fragile, not even minutes after giving birth. Her heartbeat was frantic, her throat dry, and every distant silhouette made her imagine the face of the enemy hunting them. When they reached the second corner and a security guard suddenly stepped out from the left hallway, Claire's heart nearly dropped to the floor. She froze, clutching Daniel's sleeve. "No, Daniel. I can't. I'm not sure this is safe. What if they're waiting ahead?" Her voice trembled, stripped of the steady calm of a doctor, revealing instead the choked panic of a mother being pushed against a wall. She turned as if to flee in the opposite direction, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped the bag she was holding. Daniel turned instantly, his eyes sharp as a blade though his voice remained low and steady. "Claire, look at me." But she didn't hear him. All she could hear were the alarms inside her own mind, dark hands snatching her baby away, shadows lunging from behind doors, every nightmare unfolding at once, making her knees weaken. Daniel placed his hand on her shoulder, firm enough to pull her back into the present. "Claire, listen to me. No one here wants to hurt you. No one knows where we're going. I've taken care of everything. The transport will be at the back entrance in 2 more minutes. You have to hold on. You're doing so well, do you understand?" Claire shook her head as tears spilled down her cheeks. "If something happens, if they recognize Noah, if they kill you in front of me, I can't survive that. I can't survive losing either of you." Daniel gently placed Noah into her arms and wrapped both mother and child tightly against him, grounding them with a single embrace. "I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere. You're not losing anything, Claire. You have me. You have Noah. And I swear to you I will keep all of it safe. You just have to walk with me. Trust me. We've survived worse than this. I know you're scared. I know you're exhausted. But if you break now, everything falls apart." Claire pressed her face into his chest, the familiar scent of him calming the panic just enough for her to breathe. She nodded, her chest still trembling, but her eyes softening when she looked down at her sleeping son. She drew in a deep breath, wiped her tears, and whispered, "Okay. I'll keep going." Daniel nodded, took Noah back into his arms, and led the way once more. They moved in silence, and the hallway seemed shorter now that a beam of light from the rear exit was beginning to appear. A nondescript ambulance waited outside. No license plates, no markings, just a man in medical uniform standing watch with alert eyes. Daniel looked at Claire one last time before stepping into the open air. "Just a few more minutes. Then I promise you'll breathe again. There will be no more fear." Claire squeezed his hand. This time, she was steady. She believed him, because Daniel was here. And because, even if the world beyond was falling apart, they were still a family. The ambulance cut through the narrow suburban roads of Savannah after nightfall, leaving behind the clusters of homes and drifting gradually toward the sparse forests where streetlights no longer reached. Claire held Noah close, watching through the window as dark silhouettes of trees swept past like shadows reaching toward the sky. Daniel sat beside her, eyes fixed on the small device in his hand, watching the GPS tracker and the remote security system he had activated for their hideout. Nearly an hour later, the vehicle stopped in front of a small wooden cabin, tucked beneath the trees, isolated and forgettable to anyone passing by. The oak door opened with a heavy, muted creak. Daniel stepped in first, sweeping the interior with practiced caution before signaling that it was safe. Inside, the cabin was warm and simple, a stone fireplace, worn leather chairs, piles of old books gathering dust, and a modest kitchen kept surprisingly tidy. Claire walked in, feeling as though the entire world had collapsed into this one room. She sank onto the sofa, placed Noah gently into the small crib Daniel had somehow prepared ahead of time, and leaned back, closing her eyes, her hands still resting over her chest, as though trying to steady the remnants of her breath after the panic. Daniel lit the fire, the crackling flames casting a soft glow across his sharp, weathered features. When he returned to sit beside her, he remained silent, giving her space to absorb the safety around her. Claire opened her eyes and looked at him. Something altered in her gaze, no more doubt, no more guardedness, only gratitude, tenderness, and a love she thought she had buried. "This cabin, it's yours," she whispered. Daniel nodded, eyes drifting toward the window. "It's the only place on Earth no one has managed to trace. I thought about selling it once, but for some reason, I kept it. Maybe for this day." Claire said nothing. After a moment, she leaned in and rested her head on his shoulder, where an old scar still lay beneath his sweater. "I'm sorry. For everything." Daniel didn't respond with words. He simply tightened his arm around her, offering forgiveness in the quiet strength of his embrace. They sat like that for a long while, listening to the crackle of burning wood and Noah's gentle breathing. Outside, wind rattled the trees, but inside, the world felt sealed away. Claire let out a faint, fragile laugh. "I forgot what this feels like, sitting beside you without being afraid of anything. Daniel turned to her, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "And you'll never have to fear again. Not while I'm breathing." She lifted her eyes to meet his, and for the first time in many months, they looked at each other not through pain or distance, but with a quiet peace that had been stolen from them long ago. In the warm glow of the fire, with their child sleeping safely nearby, Daniel leaned in and kissed her a slow, unhurried kiss, without fear or hesitation. The kiss of two people who had lost everything and found each other again, not by chance, but by choice. They were no longer the Daniel and Claire they once were. They were two souls who had walked through ruin and still chose to reach for one another, this time with no intention of letting go. Dawn had not yet broken when Daniel slipped quietly out of the wooden cabin. Claire was still asleep, her arms wrapped around Noah as if letting go for even a heartbeat might make the whole world collapse. He stood there for a moment, watching them, his gaze lingering on his son's tiny face, where gentle breaths rose and fell like a whispered reminder of what truly mattered. Then he turned away and closed the door without a sound. Before they arrived at the hideout, he had already set up a surveillance perimeter, motion sensors, infrared cameras, satellite-triggered alerts. But safety was only temporary. That message had not been a lone warning. It was the first signal, and Daniel knew all too well that unless he cut the threat off at its root, even the smallest misstep would leave Claire and Noah with no escape. He drove the old off-road vehicle out of the forest, across rough dirt, then merged onto an empty highway. In the back were 3 steel cases, each holding pieces of a life he had buried the day he walked away from the underworld. Specialized weapons, signal disruptors, decoding modules, and a digital map marking every facility tied to the old organization. It didn't take long for him to trace the source of the signal from the black SUV the night before. The frequency and encryption pattern led him straight to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, once used for smuggling routes, and now a hideout for the remnants of the organization that had scattered after the death of their former leader, a death delivered by Daniel's own hand. He arrived just as the sun began to rise. The wide lot lay unsettlingly silent, broken only by the sound of wind scraping against rusted tin and the distant growl of stray dogs. Daniel didn't approach the main entrance. He parked a few hundred yards away, circled behind the warehouse, and slipped into an old drainage tunnel that had once served as an internal escape route. The steel door at the end yielded instantly to his coding device, and he slipped in without the faintest noise. Inside, 3 armed men sat around a table, one of them scrolling through surveillance footage on a tablet. They had no idea Daniel was already there. He drew the knife from his boot and moved from behind. In less than half a minute, all 3 lay unconscious without a single shout. He continued on, avoiding every line of sight, shutting down power grids one section at a time, using the organization's own control hub. Each step he took was an act of retribution, not for himself, but for the months spent running, for the terror Claire had endured, and for Noah, an innocent life dragged into a storm he never deserved. When he reached the central operations room, Daniel accessed the system and extracted everything: communication logs, tracking plans, signal maps, tracing Claire's movement. It was all there. They not only knew Claire had given birth, they knew the hospital, the gender of the child, and even had images from the maternity ward's security cameras. A cold shiver crawled up his spine, but he didn't stop. With swift, practiced motions, he downloaded every file onto a portable drive and programmed a full system wipe within 5 minutes. Then he walked out, alarms beginning to blare behind him as the system detected internal tampering. Daniel did not look back. He had taken what he needed. The rest he would let fire consume. When he triggered the detonators, the trail of gasoline ignited instantly, and the warehouse erupted in flames. The inferno lit the early morning sky like the final punctuation of a darkness that had lasted far too long. He drove away, and in the rearview mirror, fire still raged, but inside him, a sheet of ice had begun to thaw. Claire was waiting. Noah was waiting. And this time, he had nothing left to lose except their peace. As the flames spread through the warehouse, Daniel was already nearly 2 miles away, driving through the thinning forest with steady speed. But inside him, another fire burned hotter. The data he had extracted wasn't just intelligence. It was undeniable proof that the true hand behind everything had never disappeared. A name he thought he had buried with his past now glared back at him from every code and document: Elias Verno. Not a mercenary, not a mere information broker, but the strategist behind the old organization, the Resses, mind that had once lifted Daniel to the pinnacle of underworld power before vanishing without a trace when the empire fractured. Elias was not like the others. He didn't act for money but for control. If he knew about Noah, if he was the one who sent that message, then nothing was over. It had only just begun. Daniel stopped at an abandoned rail station west of the city, where he had traced the last signal from a secondary server. No security cameras, no passing vehicles, just an overgrown lot choking with vines and rusted metal. He armed himself, pistol at his back, knife strapped to his leg, silenced weapon at his side. Each step echoed in the cavernous darkness of the old station, like a ticking clock winding backward. Elias was here. Daniel knew it instinctively. No gunfire, no alarms, only the final confrontation between two men who had once been allies, once fought side by side, and now stood as two opposing ends of a single choice. He entered a wide room, lit only by a single bulb, dangling overhead. A metal table sat beneath it. Elias was seated there, wearing a white shirt, holding a glass of red wine, looking more like a man awaiting a casual conversation than someone in the crosshairs of his own destruction. He looked up, his calculating eyes gleaming, lips curling into a faint smile. Nothing about him had changed, from the gentle tone of his voice to the dead cold lurking beneath each syllable. Daniel didn't reach for his gun. He knew Elias carried no weapon. Elias never needed one. Words had always been sharp enough for him. He spoke first, voice soft and almost nostalgic. "You've changed, Daniel. You would never have taken a risk like this for a woman before, and now a child too." Touching, really. Daniel said nothing, advancing toward the table with controlled, measured steps. Elias took a sip of wine, set the glass down, and tilted his head. "But you know this doesn't end just because you burned a warehouse. I still have men. When I disappear, other protocols activate. Nothing you do can stop what I've built." Daniel stopped in front of him, eyes unblinking. "What do you want?" Elias smiled, a thin, slicing curve. "I want you to remember who you are. You were the blade in my hand, the sharpest. You walked away and left me with ruins. Now I simply want you to watch as I dismantle what you're trying to protect. You saved your son today, but tomorrow it could be Claire, and after that, you." Daniel didn't answer. His body moved instead. In a flash, he drew the knife from his leg, pressing the cold steel to Elias's throat. But Elias did not flinch, not even a blink. He knew Daniel didn't kill from anger, not when there were still choices left. Elias whispered, his breath brushing Daniel's ear. "You can kill me, but you will never know peace. They will come, and this time, not for a warning. They will take your son, the same way you took everything from me." Daniel tightened his grip around the knife, then withdrew it, his voice low as thunder before a storm. "You're wrong. I didn't come here to kill you. I came to end you." Elias didn't understand, not until the faint click echoed beneath the table. In that split second when the knife lunged forward, drawing Elias's eyes to his throat, Daniel's free hand had silently slapped a magnetic charge against the underside of the steel table. A clean, sharp blast erupted as Daniel stepped back, the room shuddering under a wave of fire and collapsing steel. No gunman, no shootout. Daniel hadn't fired a single bullet. Elias never got to play his final card. When the flames died down and dust settled, Daniel walked out of the abandoned station without looking back. In his pocket was the device containing every surviving fragment of Elias's network, and inside his chest, a hollow place finally filled by a long-awaited silence. He had chosen his family, and this time, he had won. By the time Daniel steered the vehicle back onto the dirt road leading to the wooden cabin, late afternoon had settled into a heavy gray sky, its thick clouds mirroring the weight in his own chest. The car slowed with each passing yard, its tires rolling through the mud left behind by an early afternoon rain, carving a cold, lonely line through the earth. The pain in his left shoulder had begun to pulse again, the place where shrapnel had grazed him when the auxiliary charge detonated. He had cleaned it quickly, wrapped it tightly, but blood still seeped through the gauze, sliding down his shirt sleeve and gathering in his grip on the steering wheel. The pain didn't stop him, but it made every breath heavier. He didn't fear pain, only the possibility that he might not make it home in time. When the wooden door opened, Claire was standing near the fireplace with Noah in her arms, the glow of the flames tinting her hair with a soft amber light. She turned the instant she heard the faint creak of the hinges, and a moment her eyes met his, her heart seemed to fall silent. Daniel stood there, drenched in sweat and dust, his shirt torn at the shoulder, blood spreading across one side of his chest, exhaustion shadowing his eyes, though they remained fiercely alert, as always. Claire rushed toward him without a word, her trembling hand reaching for the blood soaking into the bandage. She laid Noah gently in the cradle and spun back to him, voice breaking before it escaped. "You're hurt, Daniel. You shouldn't have driven like this. Why didn't you call me? Why did you go alone?" "I was terrified." Daniel didn't answer. He only took her hand, guided it to the left side of his chest where his heartbeat thudded strong and steady beneath her palm. He leaned his forehead against hers, releasing a long breath as if shedding the last of his burden. "It's done, Claire. He's gone. No one will follow you again. No one will ever touch our son. Not ever." Claire burst into tears, not out of fear or weakness, but because for the first time after months of running and waking in dread, she finally felt the shape of peace. She helped him sit, undoing the bandage with careful, trembling fingers, washing the wound, applying clean dressings, each gentle motion as though she feared touching something deeper than flesh. Daniel never winced, only watched her, his gaze holding each tear that fell. When she finished, Claire sank beside him, resting lightly against his good shoulder, and Daniel wrapped an arm around her in return. Noah stirred in his cradle, tiny hands reaching into the air before curling back into the blanket, as if he too sensed his father's return from the storm. Daniel leaned his head back and closed his eyes. The pain was still there, but his heart felt weightless. He had come back not from a mission, not from a battlefield, but back to a life he once believed he had lost, a life named Claire, and now a small, precious life named Noah. Early morning sunlight slipped gently through the fogged window pane, painting long beams of gold across the wooden floor, like the slow breath of the waking forest. Outside, birdsong echoed between the trees and blended with the whisper of wind brushing through the leaves, creating a peaceful symphony Claire hadn't been able to truly hear for so long. In the small kitchen, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the warm scent of toast, filling the cabin with a quiet coziness that felt almost unreal. Claire stood by the sink, her hair tied back, wearing a soft cream sweater, eyes narrowing a little against the sunlight but her smile never fading. Behind her, Daniel sat in one of the wooden chairs by the table, Noah tucked securely in his arms, tiny hands waving in the air each time Daniel brushed a fingertip across his palm. Daniel murmured something to the baby, his voice low and steady like a lullaby. Every time Noah let out a small babbling sound, they both laughed the laughter of a man who had lived most of his life in shadows, now learning how to enter the light, little by little, through the presence of the child in his arms. Claire turned around, set 2 cups of coffee on the table, and sat beside her husband and their son. She rested her head on Daniel's shoulder, eyes drifting to Noah's wide, curious gaze fixed on the ceiling, as if he had just discovered an entire universe. "Do you think he'll look more like you or me?" she whispered, her voice soft enough to melt into the morning air. Daniel studied the tiny face, then looked at her, a smile rising slowly, one she hadn't seen in years. "If he inherits your will and my calculations, I'm not sure the world will have enough room for him," Claire laughed, a bright, pure sound that seemed to lift the whole room. She placed her hand on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath his gray knit shirt. No guns, no blood, no engine roaring or maps glowing on a screen, just warmth, breath, and the presence of 3 people sitting together in a quiet kitchen deep in the woods. Outside the window, a squirrel darted across the sill and disappeared into the underbrush. Claire stroked Noah's dark brown hair, whispering something in the gentle voice she once used only for newborns she cared for at the hospital. Now she was a mother, and her whispers were no longer professional, they were love. Daniel remained silent, watching them with eyes that once held only steel and calculation, now softened by something he never expected to feel. He had never imagined a morning like this could exist. A morning without orders, codes, or bloodshed, only peace and family. When Noah drifted to sleep, Daniel carried him to the small room nearby, laid him in the cradle, and returned to Claire. They sat close together, watching the quiet flicker of the fire in the hearth. Without looking at him, Claire spoke softly. "Do you think we can keep this forever?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He took her hand and squeezed it gently. I can't promise the world won't change, but I promise, from now on, you and Noah are the only priority. I won't ever walk away from this again." Claire turned and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. And in that quiet morning, deep in the forest and bathed in warm sunlight, they were no longer survivors of a storm. They were a family, a true family, and at last, they had found their way home. The afternoon drifted by in gentle quiet, sunlight filtering through the trees outside and falling across the windowsill in warm, dappled patches that felt like soft fragments of memory. Claire sat on the porch, one hand wrapped around a cup of hot tea, the other lightly touching the faint scar on her wrist, the place where Daniel had once pulled her out of a blood-soaked chaos. Now the wounds had healed, not only on her skin but deep inside her heart. The soft sound of the door opening behind her made her turn, and Daniel stepped out with that familiar, steady stride, and the deep, unreadable gaze that once made her love him, then fear him, then love him again, in a completely different way. He walked over and sat beside her, the evening light settling on his face in a way that revealed every small crease carved not by age, but by too many sleepless nights and too many chases through darkness. Claire tilted her head and rested it against his shoulder, and in that wordless moment she knew that he had changed. The man who once wore coldness like armor had shed it completely, leaving behind a husband, a father, and above all, a man ready to begin again. He took her hand, squeezed it gently, and spoke slowly. He told her he knew he was not perfect, that his past was something she could never touch without feeling pain. But from the moment he saw their child, saw her holding him, he understood that he could never return to the life he once lived. He didn't want to, he didn't need to. Claire did not speak. A tear slipped down her lips, and she let it fall, letting it say what words could not. Daniel continued, his voice sinking into the evening breeze. From this day forward, he promised, he would never let her face anything alone. He would learn how to live not as someone who had survived war, but as someone who knew how to love, how to forgive, how to accept. For her, for Noah, for everything he had once lost and now held again in his hands. Claire turned to him, eyes red but glowing like the last two stars lingering after a violent storm. She said she had never stopped loving him. Even when she walked away, even when she was terrified, she had never stopped believing that if he found his way back, she would forgive him. Not because he was the only man she had ever loved, but because he was the only one who made her believe love could exist even in the dark. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, a place he had once pressed a hurried goodbye before disappearing into danger. This time, there was no rush, no fear, no hiding. Inside the house behind them, Noah slept peacefully in his cradle, his soft breaths rising like a quiet melody through the still forest. Daniel looked at Claire once more, something tender yet fierce burning in his eyes, a vow that didn't need to be spoken, a beginning that didn't need to be announced, and the light of a new day shining not through windows clouded by fear, but directly into the hearts of two people brave enough to return to each other after everything. Life sometimes leads us through storms we think we'll never survive, only to gift us, unexpectedly, with a peaceful morning meant for those brave enough to hold on to what they love most. The story of Daniel and Claire is proof of that. They lost each other, endured misunderstanding, pain, and threats, yet they found their way back not as two broken souls barely standing, but as a true family. The arrival of Noah was not just the birth of a child, but the embodiment of hope, of rebirth through honest love, forgiveness. Though once buried beneath the darkness of his past, Daniel chose to walk toward the light, not merely to protect the people he loved, but to start anew with presence and accountability. Claire chose to love him again, not for the man he had been, but for the man he had become. This story reminds us that sometimes loving someone is not about holding on tightly, but about letting go at the right moment, trusting that if you truly belong to one another, you will find your way back. And you, after hearing this story, how do you feel? Have you ever lost something or someone, only to find it again in a way that felt nothing short of miraculous? We would be grateful to hear your honest reflections in the comments below. If this story touched you, please remember to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who might need a little inspiration, a little hope, and a gentle reminder that real love always finds a way home. Thank you for watching, wishing you abundant health, joy, and peace in each day of your life. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.